Joining me in this episode is Matt Poepsel, the godfather of talent optimization at the Predictive Index. We're talking generational impact and perspectives on AI in this episode. Enjoy the conversation. You're listening to Working Forward, a future of work focused podcast from People Forward Network. These episodes pave the road ahead, helping us confidently step into the future as a leader who moves people forward. After all, the best way to predict the future is to create it. Let's go. Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Working Forward, your Future of Work podcast. And hey, we've been having a lot of fun doing these live stream style. So here's another live stream one coming your way. So hello to our folks on LinkedIn and YouTube that are following along, and those who may be following the stream in our Riverside studio as well. We've got a phenomenal episode for you today. We've got the godfather of talent optimization himself, Dr. Matt Poepsel from the Predictive Index is with us. Matt, thank you for joining us today, sir.
It's my pleasure, Jason. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We're just catching up on the holidays. I got the little Christmas tree going back here. It's that wonderful time of year when I think a lot of us start doing a lot of reflection, right? And so one of the things we want to get into today is we're going to be talking about AI. Who isn't these days, right? But I think you have a unique angle and experiences around this and insight in terms of the younger generation and what it's meaning for them right now. And so that's going to be kind of like the main topic, the main thread of what we're going to talk about today. But before we get into that, let's start with you and help the listeners get to know you a little bit better. Tell us about you. And then let's start getting into what's some of the stuff that's got your attention right now with AI. So tell us about you, Matt.
Yeah, sometimes we like to hear those origin stories, where did Spider-Man, Wolverine, where do they come from, right? So it's one of those things where I would say that my really formative time began in the Marine Corps, where I spent 6 years. So I got that good foundation of military service, and then went on to work at a software company and was really hungry for more of that leadership that I learned in the service, and realized that in the civilian world, we don't necessarily do that the same way. So I decided to get my PhD in psychology of coaching and leadership and kind of take my study to that next level. Before I started work for the Predictive Index, where we do behavioral analytics and these kinds of things. And now I also teach at Boston College, leadership and HR. So at this stage of my career, I'm really interested in kind of taking what I've learned and discovered to make leadership and organizational effectiveness a little bit easier, perhaps, for those who are coming along behind us. And it's just something I really, really enjoy. I've tried to pay attention along the way. I try to take complex concepts and make them simple. And I'm really glad we're talking about this topic today, because I don't get to talk about it all that often, Jason. So thanks for sharing the air with me and let me explore together with you this really important topic.
It is an important topic, and I'm glad we have you speaking into it today because you're taking an angle on it, Matt, that is really important to me. And I'll be honest, I don't have a lot of expertise on it. So I'm really excited to ask you questions and learn from you today. But it seems like with so much of the AI talk right now, a lot of what's dominating is what's going on right now for people who maybe are older on in their careers. Are they going to reskill? Are they going to upskill? I love what you're focusing on, which is what is this meaning for the younger generations? Like, let's start extrapolating out. What's it mean for those entering the job market right now? But also in the next 5 years, what does it mean for those kids who may be in college right now or getting ready to go to college, or maybe they're going to trade? They're about to enter young adulthood and wondering, what the heck? What is the economy going to look like for me? What are the types of jobs? I love that we're taking this angle today because, as you know, and we've talked about, I've got 4 sons and my oldest is only 12. But he already is asking me questions when we're watching like YouTube, something on YouTube TV. It'll come up and there'll be like a Gemini commercial or something. And it's got him wondering, like, what are going to be the types of jobs that I have in the future? So all that to say, Matt, let's go there and start talking about what are those things you're learning right now or hearing from the younger generation with respect to the job market and AI.
Yeah, it's one of those things where if I think back to when I first entered the workforce, I didn't really think that much about generational differences. I was subject to them like we all are, where every generation sort of evolves perhaps a little bit faster than the workplace, which doesn't tend to evolve quite as quickly. And what I have realized now is that the today's generation is very much attuned to the differences between generations. So I think some of those generational values, for example, the boomers who were largely raised by people who grew up in the Great Depression, really looked at something like loyalty. Really important. Let's get a job, stay there for 40 years, retire. Won't that be great? You'll have had a successful life. And life was something that happened on the weekends and at night outside of the job, right? There was this real separation between the two. By the time I came into the workforce, Gen X, we were looking for a little bit more independence. We were really programmed almost to try to do better than our parents did, right? And really try to make something of ourselves. A lot of us were the first ones in our generation to go to in our family line to go to college. That was a big thing for a lot of Gen X people. And then, what it really brought my mind to this, Jason, is when I started thinking about the fact that who am I to talk about Gen Z? Well, my bride and I raised three of them, so I had a little bit of experience.
Yeah.
But they've entered the workforce now, and they've gotten to that point where they're out of undergrad, and they're now entering this world of work at a very tumultuous time. And this is where my mindset and taking a step back and looking and thinking more broadly about what a lot of that generation who's now leaving college at this very unusual time or leaving high school, going into the world of work, and then seeing that it's really tumultuous right now. And that's what I'm looking forward to exploring with you.
Yeah, and with that, Matt, so what do you think has to change? I know that's a big question. I'm sure there probably are changes in terms of our educational system, right? Even K through 12 education. What are we teaching right now? What are we teaching over the next few years? What needs to change in our, institutions at college and higher ed? What needs to change in terms of how we're training and developing in organizations? Can you walk us through what some of those changes need to be to prepare us for the future of work?
Yeah, I think about I step back and I think about the just level of awareness has to change. I think we don't even realize sometimes how much different trends, different forces are really impacting us. We hear about AI all the time. That's true. But I think what we don't always talk about is the fact that Gen Z is rejecting management roles at an alarming rate and basically saying that I don't want to be a people leader because it looks like a lot more headache, a lot more stress. It's going to
Wow.
destroy what little work life balance I have, and for not a lot of dough. So it's really a problem inside of a lot of organizations of saying people are wanting to stay on the specialist track as opposed to manage other people. And I hear that, for example, Jason, and I think, oh my gosh, like some of my greatest and best experiences at work have been, nurturing and developing other future leaders. We're doing it so badly right now that people don't even want to take on that role. And that's going to cause a tremendous problem when you think about the leadership capacity that we need to navigate all this change. If people don't even want to become leaders really in organizations, that's part of a real problem. Another example is when I see research that says something like 75% of Gen Z wants to be entrepreneurs. They want to be sole proprietors or to strike out on their own because of a combination of wanting that autonomy that they're not getting at work, having the flexibility they're not getting from traditional forms of employment, low levels of trust in leadership, and even of the system, which increasingly seems to be focused on productivity and profit at the expense sometimes of people. When you see thousands of people being laid off with an email because we're going to just plow our resources into AI, then all this is challenging. Another thing is that entry level jobs, a lot of companies have eliminated many of the entry level jobs because they're hoping that AI can have a more cost effective way of doing some of the more basic things. But I don't think we've done the math fast enough to say what happens when you haven't defined new entry level job equivalents that are still doing the things that only humans can do in order to actually advance our organizations and make them more competitive. We've only done the first part, which is to say freeze hiring for entry level because maybe this AI stuff can save us a ton of dough. You're like, well, wait a second. Not only are there real lives hanging in the balance, there's also a measure of competitiveness that we're not tapping into because we just haven't figured it out yet. We're so focused on the other part of the economic equation. So I think all of this is taking place. And then to answer your question, when you think about how well are we preparing the future generation who's going to, eventually become sort of in that middle of their career, how are we preparing them for the uncertain future that awaits them? The answer is, in my opinion, not well. Not well. We're not necessarily teaching them critical thinking skills, social skills, entrepreneurial skills. We're not doing that in our own organizations. That's the same thing I found when I said, I'm still hungry for leadership coming out of the military. And the civilian world was like, too bad. Like, we don't do that here. And you're like, well, we need to. And then the second is that inside the school systems, I don't know about, the average school system, but I don't get the sense that it's really developing those same sorts of entrepreneurial type skills that these young people are going to need as they continue to navigate a very uncertain, a very independent, a very freelance in some ways kind of future. So those are just some of the macro forces that are really causing challenges in creating a rift between what I call the employer employee divide. When you look at that through the lens of Gen Z specifically, it is particularly pronounced. And at a time when we need to have our generations working together and using all of their collective strengths and all the different beautiful aspects of our values that we have across the different generations, the opposite of that is happening. And it's creating really the worst of all worlds in some ways.
With what you just described there, the thing that really stood out to me, you talked about how Gen Z is not really looking for those people leader type positions. Like they're like, that doesn't sound very appealing to me. A lot of reasons for that. But one of the things you shared, I wonder if it ties into it, is do we have some lagging skills in that area of knowing how to do that well? I don't think any of us are ever born innately with those skills. It's one of those things you have to work on. It takes a lot of work, right? Even if you have the heart to be a servant leader, you still have to learn the actual skills, how to communicate, how to remove obstacles, how to conduct reviews or feedback sessions, right? There's all these things that go into making for a really good relationship to bring out the best in people as a leader. You mentioned how a lot of those things seem to be lacking in schools, right? That it seems like the emotional intelligence aspects, the adaptive skills, that a lot of those things are not being directly taught. And I'll be honest, I wasn't directly taught them, but here's what I was taught, Matt, and I'm sure this probably is for you also, because we're in pretty similar generations. I learned a lot of that stuff through unstructured play when there weren't adults around, and it's like, okay, I'm with a bunch of other kids. Oh crap, this just happened. What am I gonna do? Whether it's I just got in a conflict with another kid and I've got to work this out, whether it's, oh no, I thought I had a ride home. I don't. What am I going to do in order to get home? Kind of stuff that like you had to flex those muscles. I think we did in our generation a little bit more because there was some more autonomy and independence, I think, to a certain extent, where even if you weren't being directly taught those things in school, you had to figure things out. And it feels like now, because of the way culture is, and for good reason, most of us, you can't just let your kids out unsupervised, right? Just in the world that we're in now. But I think the unintended consequence that comes from that is it's like, well, a lot of those things that we may have learned in our natural environment through unstructured play and being with others, we're not getting as much of that. Our noses are in screens more often. And schools haven't necessarily, and I'm not picking on schools. I used to work in schools. We love our educators, but it's to the point that you're making is we probably need to be reframing and reorganizing in schools how important it is to be teaching this EQ, this emotional intelligence component, these adaptive skills, because the opportunities to develop those outside of school aren't what they used to be. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think everything has changed and everything always will change and continues to change. And some things have gotten easier and some things have gotten harder. But I think that you bring up a really good point when you think about if you go back to our childhood, for example, and things have when we think about our experiences, our expectations, the way that we process and develop an understanding of the world, these things all begin with our early family systems. And then through our adolescence, we start to understand and develop our own belief systems, if you will. And I don't even just mean it in a spiritual sense or anything else, just the way that you believe the world works and should work. And so I give you a real quick example. When I was a kid, this is probably like in grade school, I had a friend and he said, I can go anywhere I want, anytime I want, but I have to be able to hear my dad when he whistles. That was the thing. So if we played inside my house because it was like hot outside or something, he would just have to have the window open so he could hear his dad. And didn't care where it was. He could extend as far as the neighborhood as he could hear. And you're like, could you imagine in this day and age saying to a kid, I don't care if you go across the street, the highway, it doesn't matter, just as long as you can hear, me whistle or whatever. Totally different. Then you start to see fast forward and say, like, I didn't raise my kids that way. They had organized school activities, play dates. We had, friends of friends and shuttling kids around. Everything was organized for them. They didn't really have to really have any unstructured time at all, really, when it came to that. And so then when those kids inevitably entered the workforce, and they've had this entire upbringing where everything was very set out for them, or at least, co-developed or co-organized, like, can I go over to Susie's house or whatever? Totally different than what I grew up with. But what happened now is that you can also think about the nature of entrepreneurship, for example, and say that while and to some extent, having everything organized for you kind of hurts that entrepreneurialism because you don't have to figure it out on your own. You don't have to develop all those social skills. At the same time, the path to entrepreneurship is so much easier than it used to be. And I talk to my kids now and they buy some stuff, for example, in a TikTok shop. And I'm like, what is a TikTok shop? And they're like, oh, it's super easy. I see a video. I like it. They have a simple shop. I just, click through on my phone and then all of a sudden I buy the thing. So who can be an entrepreneur? The answer is anybody who's got a phone can be an entrepreneur if they want. They just create a product, look at Etsy, look at all these things. If you truly want to be an entrepreneur and develop a product or a service and sell it to the marketplace, it's easier than ever, arguably, to do that. Now, you still have to work at it, be a success, all those things, learn marketing, sales, and not everybody wants to do that. But I think that rather than try to take any generation and stuff it into an old box or look at it with an outdated lens, we just have to ask ourselves, sort of, where are things headed and how do we help prepare each generation, including boomers that are now transitioning to different types of employment than we've ever had, and everyone in between, to both contribute to organizational success because we need our companies to be a success, but also socially to make sure that we're adhering to the principles, and also personally, individually, that we're having success and that we're flourishing and not struggling the way that we seem to be struggling right now. Yeah.
So it makes sense the way you just described it. You mentioned the number 75% of Gen Zs are interested in being entrepreneurs. And I was going to ask you why that is, but I think you actually answered it. You said it's easier than ever right now to be an entrepreneur. And I have not thought about that, but that makes so much sense. Going back to my experience, back to 2012, when I first started cutting my teeth in being an entrepreneur in helping to start a SaaS company, software as a service. Let me tell you, just in the last 10 years of what it was like to design, build, and go to market with a minimally viable product in software 10 years ago, it was really freaking hard, especially if you're like this guy right here. And I don't know how to write a single line of code. And so you have offshore developers that you're working with, and there's lines of communication there to make sure that there's shared understanding of what's being built and the timelines. And then just the sheer amount of time that it would take to get an MVP up for you to test. And I look at it now and I talk with folks that are in the software world, and it's like we're talking totally different languages. And they're like, oh, this is what you need? Ready by tomorrow or in
Yeah,
2 days.
we got AI will write it for you. We can do vibe coding. It's all changing. It's all going to continue to change. There's no judgment. This is the thing that I want us to understand. When I talk about Gen Z or I talk about even Gen Alpha that's coming up behind them, I offer my observations with zero judgment because the reality is that I don't want to take my own personal worldview and experience of having grown up and try to superimpose that on anybody because it's not going to end with Gen Alpha, who hasn't even entered the workforce fully yet. The first generation beta babies have been born already. It's unbelievable. It's never going to stop. It just continues to be new. So we always have to be prepared to not take a look at the map of the past that served us well, perhaps, or maybe it didn't, and then apply that as if it's predictive of the future, especially in a time when everything is changing so rapidly. Like you mentioned, the way that we, build a minimum viable product, or the way that we go to market, or anything else. And I think the part that for some reason I started to have this realization, Jason, that I was thinking, in many ways, we have created and issued a broken promise to Gen Z. And then I'm talking about myself as a parent of that generation and saying that we had told them and imprinted our values upon them to say, work-life balance is important. You shouldn't have to have mental distress in your life at school and these things. We offered the play dates and the organization, all these things. And then didn't do the math fast enough to realize that we would be in the workforce long enough that they would show up and work for us. And then we say, because we haven't figured out how to provide all those things that we told you were important when you were at home, now you're here at work and we don't know how to get that and still hit our profitability and productivity targets. So forget all that we and other parents like us said, and instead just forget all that and just put your nose to the grindstone, and here come all these outdated sort of models. And I think that if I was Gen Z, my head would be spinning. I'm so confused. You raised me a certain way, you told me a thing, and I'm not taking away their accountability. We can come back to that in a second. But I am saying that there's this sort of mixed signals, if you will, between take on work that's meaningful. Make sure that you're having taking care of your own physical and mental wellness as much as you're doing good work for the company. Don't feel you're committed to one career forever, right? The way that certainly my grandparents would have worked for 40 years in the same factory. Like those models were gone. And instead, then when they enter the workforce now and we say, we can't support and fulfill any of what we told you to look for when it comes to work. And now in a post AI world, in a world focused with economic headwinds on productivity, as opposed to, sort of anything like what resembled during the post pandemic cycle of the great resignation, it's almost like the pressure, my student loans are high, but the wages are frozen and the entry level jobs are gone. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is happening. It's all happening so quickly for them. No wonder they're disenchanted when it comes to work and trying to reconcile, how do I pay for all these escalating costs at a time when I can barely find, entry level work because everybody's so gaga over AI? It's a lot. And I think that we just have to demonstrate some level of empathy, but also some level of accountability to help navigate it in partnership. We can't ever turn to any generation and say, you don't have to have a strong work ethic. That'll never work. We can't have that. But to say that you have to work the way we used to, I just saw that Instagram, as of today, said we're returning to the office 5 days a week starting in February. Okay. Wow. Holy cow. So, that's going to continue to happen. And there's going to be this tug of war because, but imagine that you're a Gen Z person and you're thinking, well, what if that suits me well? What if it doesn't suit me well? It won't land evenly on that generation either. Many of which, by the way, are caregivers to older parents now and grandparents who are living longer than ever and can't afford the rising healthcare costs. So that's not going to land on them equally either. I think that doesn't get talked about enough. It's a lot. It's a lot. So again, partnership to me is the only way that we can kind of navigate our way through this together and recognize that, yes, we need employees to have that strong work ethic and be flexible. And if they lack social skills, they need to develop them. If we need them to be more entrepreneurial or be open to a certain type of work, that's reasonable to ask that. But as employers, we have to do our part too, to recognize that they're coming into the workplace with a different set of expectations and ideals, and we need to navigate that together. We need to find compromise, middle ground, if you will. We can't just be completely one-sided because the job market today allows us to squeeze people. Well, eventually these things are cyclic. And when it opens up again, those employees have long memories. And as soon as they can bolt, they will. And I guarantee that's going to happen soon.
Toffler back in the 60s and 70s talked about future shock. And Matt, hearing you speak, I can't help but think all of us right now are experiencing future shock. But I think especially that has to be the case for the younger generations that you mentioned, because they may have just wrapped up college. They may be early on in the labor market, and they're like, everything that I invested in, everything I was told to do, to your point, what is it doing for me now? Like this world of work already today, December 2nd of 2025, already looks totally different than it did 1 year ago at this time. How many more layoffs have occurred, especially within the Fortune 500 companies, due to AI job displacement? I think the actual numbers due to AI displacement is around 10 to 11% of those layoffs in terms of what was explicitly laid out for the justification for those. The number could be higher, but that's what they actually put out there. And then you have these recent reports that just came out, and I want to get your reactions to those. I'm going to reference them real quick. One was the MIT study. And again, these came out just before Thanksgiving. The MIT study said that AI can already replace 11.7% of the US workforce. And then it was within a day or two later, McKinsey, they had a study come out that said 57% of current work can be automated with today's AI capabilities, where we are right now, December of 2025. And so I had the benefit, you had the benefit of having worked in an economy that, for the most part, operated by the fundamental traditional rules of supply and demand. And there's a labor market, and we can predict these things. And we know as one thing goes up, another thing will tend to go down. And that's not the way it is now. And so for this younger generation, I'm like, I love that you said we've got to empathize with them instead of saying, it's tough. Here, you need to go do these things. It really does feel like we need to have some empathy with them to be like, yeah, a lot of the things that you may have been taught, a lot of the things I may have said to my kids is like, hey, have a short memory. Because actually, that thing I told you a few years ago, that probably isn't good advice now. Here, as we stand today, is probably what we need to do. I think all of us are feeling a little bit of future shock, don't you think?
I think so. And I think when we look at the macro trends as an example, a lot of the AI displacement is going to be around restructuring jobs more than eliminating jobs, because I think that right now there's a lot of hype. And I think that as you're seeing a lot of backlash now against AI work slop, where things look like they can be done. How many of us have had the experience now lately when you had to call in to get some customer service and you almost can't get humans anymore? You only get AI that's kind of in its early stages of trying to be helpful. And you would say that maybe on paper, on somebody's spreadsheet, they're saying this human job was done, better or more cost effectively by AI. But my frustration is through the roof right now because I know it's AI and it's not a pleasant experience. And that will continue to get better. I'm no Luddite. But at the same time, I think that's where some of those numbers can be a little bit misleading. One thing that's not misleading is the fact that our longevity as humans is longer than ever, especially in developed nations. And so that means that the boomer generation, which is, has begun to phase out of active work, is entering a time of their life where they're going to need prolonged healthcare. And what you know when you talk to healthcare CEOs is that a lot of times it's very difficult to fill non-clinical roles that make healthcare systems go. When you think about assisted living, when you think about hospital systems, and you're not talking about doctors and nurses in this case, you're talking about people who do the basic infrastructure work, pushing brooms, emptying bedpans, et cetera. And that's not glamorous work, but AI is not doing that work. And if you talk about mechanics, I saw the CEO of Ford saying, I need something like 500,000 mechanics and I can't find them because people don't want to become mechanics. Well, this is your supply and demand argument, Jason. And I'm not saying that we all need to give up our dreams of having cyber jobs so that we can go do stuff that whatever's left over after the computers take all the quote unquote good stuff. But I do think it recognizes the fact that these things are tectonic. Gen Z is not a very large generation compared to the boomers. My generation of Gen X is one of the smallest. And so you're going to end up with this problem, a long-term problem of the workforce. In the short term, it doesn't seem to be an issue because we're seeing so many layoffs. We see unemployment's not like skyrocketed high, but it's felt in certain industries very acutely. But there are other industries like construction, manufacturing, and some others that are still having talent shortages. So it's very lumpy. And I think what happens is it's also very emotional. So when you're a Gen Z person and you just got your 4-year degree, because that's what you were told was kind of expected, the way high school would have been expected for me in a way that it wasn't for my grandparents. It was like you didn't even need to finish high school necessarily. And so now it's like, a lot of Gen Z kids today were like, well, of course you're going to college. And you're like, well, I guess of course I'm going to college. And then now you see headlines that say, well, because of AI, what a waste of money. You'll never see a return on that investment of your 4-year college. And they're thinking, well, that's freaking great. So now I've got all this student loan debt and I work so hard to get a degree that's not helping me. And AI is taking all the entry level jobs. I can't even get the experience to get the experience. You almost have to start as a VP or a director. And you're like, what is happening? Right. So this is where that empathy comes in to say, wait a second, we've got a lot of jobs that are going unfilled. We have specific things like leadership you mentioned earlier that are not even happening in companies because it's never been easy. The social aspects, the customer facing roles, the value add roles, things that AI can't do, because if AI can do it, then it's not value add. It's commoditized immediately because everyone has access to the same AI. So when you think about the true human skills that push organizations forward, like how are we getting promising young work ethic oriented people who want to contribute and do a good job? How are we getting them into those roles? And that's where I think this understanding of, well, what are your expectations for work? What is it you're looking for from work? And when Gen Z says we want some level of autonomy, flexibility, we want feedback and coaching, we want some level of purpose and meaning, we want some level of balance. And you look at the transcript and you're like, as a human society, those things don't seem all that out of whack to me. But when you look at organizations' ability to fulfill those things for a variety of reasons, it's not there. And that's why we're seeing this disenchantment and to be honest with you, Jason, an increasing sense of betrayal. I hear it in the voice of CEOs who say, I got people on my payroll who don't want to work. And I say, you're talking about people who you're paying below market, who have two side hustles, and who volunteer on the weekends to a cause that they're committed to. And you're saying they have no work ethic. They just don't want to work for you. Right. I'm not saying that that's showing up in the right way. If Gen Z is withdrawing, in this case, from the CEO, some of their specific level of really leaning into the organization. But I think it's a misread of these macro forces that are really pulling us apart. And it's creating this tremendous rift because when employees look at the employers and say, you're only out to either replace me or to squeeze me so you can get your profit, you can put new tires on your Porsche or whatever it is that you're into, like these things start to ring hollow for an entire generation of workers who's saying, this is why I'm supposed to sacrifice my work-life balance and give in to hustle culture. Like I don't even understand or identify with this at all. So this is where the breakdowns happen. And when that happens, it creates this distance between us. We're seeing the natural forces of what I refer to as entropy that pull organizations apart. And it's, again, I offer this with no judgment. The reality is that in an increasingly complex world, any system will continue to trend in this direction. But we have to do the hard work to pull ourselves back together, to draw ourselves together through the leadership of commitment. And that means a bidirectionality of employers being committed to employees and understanding them and trying as best they can to meet their needs and expectations. And the same is true for employees who understand what the employer is trying to accomplish. And I don't have to go further than my grocery store to see this break down, Jason. Every time I go to my local grocery store, I see young people who are taking those entry-level jobs that AI can't do, but they've always got their AirPods in. And when you have your AirPods in, what are you saying to customers? I don't really, I, not interested in communicating with you. Now, I don't know what coaching they've got to be able to say like, "Hey, if you wanna get ahead around here," right? Or how do you make that palatable? I'm not in that industry, I'm not in that business, but I think it's one of those examples where we have a mutual responsibility, right, to help one another, and that's I don't wanna paint with broad brushstrokes, but every time I see that small example, I'm reminded of saying, "Is that a generational difference, or is that a young person who just needs some coaching?" Like we have to have the conversation about it. We have to have a little bit more of an open mind in both directions about it. We have to find that partnership and understand like, how to really lift one another up in that case.
I love that perspective. That's refreshing of always being on the curious side, as Ted Lasso often calls it, of just not, rushing to judgment and being like, well, this person's just rude. Like, no, they may not understand how it's coming across in coaching them. That's a coaching opportunity, like you just said. As you were also speaking, Matt, I hadn't thought about this before until you mentioned it with the entropy. But when we take a step back and we think about where have we been with the quote unquote labor market in the last 5 years, we have gone from one pendulum swing where it was totally in favor of talent and employees and basically being able to say, uh, you know, we're going to be doing working from home, because I can be just as productive. It feels like the pendulum now, because of AI and the potential threat of like displacement of certain types of work or roles, that the pendulum now is starting to swing the other direction, where maybe employers aren't as willing to consider certain requests or things, even if they're very reasonable, but where like quote unquote the power maybe has shifted the other direction. And all of this has transpired, it feels like, within the last 5 years of having gone from a pandemic where everyone's trying to figure out, okay, like we're going to let more people be working from home, which means we need to have more people that are equipped, that we know we can trust and are going to do really good work and manage their time and are very productive and efficient, and how to create a cohesive culture if more people are working from home. And within 5 years now, we've shifted this other direction where there's the RTO mandates and more that the larger employers are saying, well, if you want to work here, then this is how it's going to be, kind of thing. And to play into that, we love that we have our folks that are tuning in live and providing any commentary. We actually heard from Susan Barr. Susan, thank you, and hello from San Diego. And this is what Susan was sharing. She said, going back to what you're talking about, our generations, Matt, she said, my mom rang a brass bell to get us home when we were playing in the neighborhood. So similar to when you were talking about your buddy and his dad would whistle about getting home. And then he said, our mom would also whistle for us in the stores. And she was like, that was so embarrassing. But then she also said, I'm required to work on site 100%. It's totally unnecessary. I'm against return to office mandates. We proved during COVID that we can be highly productive and successful in a hybrid arrangement. And totally agree with you, Susan. Thank you for those comments. Want to get your thoughts on some of those comments from Susan, Matt.
I'm glad that somebody else had the experience growing up where our auditory capabilities dictated how far we could stray from our folks. And can you imagine if like you said, if I whistle in the store, then you have to come find me? Like, would you ever let your kid out of your sight in this day and age? Like, almost never, right? So everything changes. And again, I offer without judgment. But I think that the point about return to office is interesting, right? Because what happens is there's a tremendous amount of resentment that builds up. If you make me do something that doesn't check out for reasons that I understand or agree with, and we haven't really had a conversation about it, a thoughtful one, then all of a sudden, that can tend to break down, and it creates that sort of distance between, in this case, employer and employee. And I think a lot of times employers might be able to say, we're just more comfortable. And I saw even in the Instagram announcement, well, we're more creative when we're together. And, I understand that there's certain types and times when that is the case for sure. But I think how many times have you seen people who are in the office, but they're not really as productive, or they're just sitting over in the corner gossiping, but they're in the office. So is it about distrust? Why we want people back in the office? And at the same time, that there's somebody folding laundry right now when they're working at home, when they never would have done that, obviously, in the office. So there's abuses on both sides, which is again why I'll say it again. I don't come at it with judgment, but I think as an observation goes, the best place to do the work is the place where you can do the work the best, right? And sometimes that means being at home. And I think if you're a millennial, for example, and you say, if I go into the office, I'm now going to sit in 45 minutes of traffic. I'm not going to be able to put my kids on the bus. And when I get to the office, if half my day is spent on Zoom anyway, like, what have I accomplished? Or those sorts of things become, it really doesn't land on everyone equally. And I've seen in some cases, Gen Z actually prefers to go to some of these urban offices because they live with roommates downtown if they're earlier in their career. But it's the people who are in mid-career and they've moved out to the suburbs to raise kids that are saying, oh, I'll have to go in the office. That's like a chore for me. And I think the other thing that's challenging, Jason, is when you talk about a decision like return to office affects existing employees. If you go to apply for a job and they say, look, the requirement here is that you work 5 days a week, and you're like, you know what? I don't want to do that. I'm not going to apply for this job. Okay. Nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with an employer saying, like, this is how we do things around here. That's their right. But I think where it's a little bit hard is when things change. And so when you look at things that we can't change, for example, like RTO mandates for existing employees, when you think about the input of generational differences, just you ever have some fun, sit down with some older, more experienced nurses and have them talk about Gen Z nurses. That's a lot of fun. Hey, bring popcorn if you listen to those conversations, because I find in that industry in particular, there's a lot of opinions about generational differences. But then also AI. When you think about nobody asked for this, like people who are more conservative are saying, like, this isn't good. I didn't ask for this and I don't want this. So anytime you're talking about disruptions to an existing relationship, we need to approach those a little bit more gingerly, perhaps, than we do when we're setting a new expectation for people who aren't even employees yet. That's a totally different situation, because then they understand more eyes wide open what they're getting into. But we'll all experience those changes. That makes sense. So I appreciate that comment from Susan, and it's really a breakdown of what I call mutuality. Mutuality is one of my it's one of my mechanisms, if you will, of commitment. And commitment is something that really serves to close that distance, and it breaks down, it counteracts that entropy we were talking about a little bit earlier. Mutuality means that there's an understanding that we're each in it to support and benefit in equal measure one another. So in this case, the employer-employee relationship that we were describing earlier is a bit of a breakdown because we're not experiencing mutuality. I see what's in it for you. You want us all to be under your nose so you can sort of kind of keep tabs on us, but I'm not experiencing the productivity gain. It's actually quite a it actually impinges me a little bit because it takes away my quality of life. I'm now sitting in an hour and a half of traffic every day. And to accomplish what? And we're really not that much more productive. It's totally unnecessary. That's a breakdown of mutuality. And when that happens, you see this devolution into self-interest. The employer says, "Well, I don't care. That's just how we want it done. So you're just going to have to do that if you want to be here." And you're like, "Okay, that seems pretty one-sided." At the same time, that an employee who takes advantage of their remote work situation and being away from the watchful eye of the manager and does something on company time that they shouldn't be, that's self-interest too. That's one-sided. That's no good. So I think when we violate mutuality and one side tries to get over on the other, that's going to be a breakdown of that commitment, and that's going to allow those forces of entropy only to draw us further and further apart.
I like that description, mutualism. Companies look out for your people, people will look out for the company. I know a lot of leaders have heard that, but I think right now it's really important to remember that because now, instead of just saying it, we got to live it, right? Because we're going through such transformative change. And as you put it, the entropy, we can feel the entropy right now, that the chasm tends to be getting wider in terms of the trust between people and organizations, that now's the time to put our money where our mouth is and actually step into and lead that way and run our organizations that way of trusting our people, and not going further down the ladder like, well, I'm going to hold all the cards and I'm going to tell you the way that it's going to be. I don't know about you, Matt, but in most of my relationships, they don't turn out well if I take that kind of a attitude. If I were to say to my wife, "Hey, take it or leave it. This is the way I am, babe. This is the way I'm going to be." I don't think that I'm going to be happily married for very long. I don't think my sons are going to have their dad around here at the house for very long. But even outside of marital relationships, you think about any relationship, and this goes for professional, there has to be respect, trust, these foundational values you talk about. Those things are always going to be timeless. And those things are put to the test when you're in the grinder, both the organization and people. And it feels like we're in one of those periods of time right now where we're figuring things out. We know the global economy is changing. We know that the labor market's changing. We know the types of work is changing. And so we're being tested. But that is when we can reveal our character, are in those moments when the things that were really easy to say, when things were hunky-dory and everything was going as planned, now's the time when you double down and you lead that way and you show, even when it might be harder to do so, that you're going to do the right thing and lead the right way and put your people first. And I can't help but think that that is a key to being a sustainable company. Do you agree?
Yeah, 100%. And I feel like no matter what happens in any relationship, if you're in that relationship long enough, you will be tested. Like you, I'm a married man, 30 years for me, and you will be, there are just natural things that happen in life that are going to put strain and pressure on any relationship. It's true of any friendship. It's true of parenting relationships. It's true of if you volunteer for your local church or synagogue or anything like that. uh, any human system is going to experience some level of strain and breakdown, and that's because that's what all systems do. So for us to say that there's a lot of pressure right now, yeah, and guess what? It's not going to change because the reality is we've hit this tipping point in the classic Gladwell term that the acceleration of change and the extent of change has outpaced our ability to hold ourselves together. And that means that we're digesting technological change, the economic, the geopolitical divisiveness, the generational differences, the level of stress and burnout, I don't want to say fracturing of families, but the geographic dispersion of families. When I grew up, everybody lived right next door on the same street. Now they're halfway across the country. All of these things are contributing to the fact, and they're not bad things, but any system will naturally descend toward disorder. But again, just to your point that you were making, leadership and trust and commitment basically draws these things back together. So what we're seeing now is that this level of breakdown and distancing that's happening is happening faster than we're able to hold ourselves together. back to your earlier point, when you talk about this power balance and this shift during the Great Resignation, when there were a lot of freedoms because employers were scrambling to say like, "What's this post-pandemic world going to look like?" Employees took advantage and started moving around. Great Resignation. I'm out. See you later. And employers remembered that. And then now we're in a phase where employers tend to have a lot of the power, especially in certain markets where jobs are a little bit more scarce than they were. People aren't hiring like they were because of the economic uncertainty and some of the focus on productivity and trying to absorb, well, let's just hold off before we make that hire. Let's see if AI, some of this AI stuff's going to pan out. We may not need to hire all those, people in those roles. Whoa. Now all of a sudden, the employees are going to have long memories. And as soon as the market inevitably opens up again, because these things are cyclic, it always will, then there's potential that they're going to bolt. And I've heard it, revenge quitting is something that we hear about. Like, I'm really unhappy, but I don't want to be out there. So I'm going to stay here, but I'm stewing. So I've got this negative energy happening. And as soon as I see daylight, I'm out. Like, that's absolutely going to happen. I'm not saying that that's right, but I'm saying to your earlier point that you were making, if we forget the power struggle and we approach with partnership. And we recognize, like in any relationship, we can make concessions, we can listen, we can try to understand, we can not be so quick just to sort of enforce our self interest and instead put more weight on the collective interest, right? And that mutuality, like I talked about earlier. Now, all of a sudden, we have a fighting chance to keep ourselves together. I mentioned that my military career is how I started, right? And we put a lot of emphasis on commitment to oneself, to, in my case, the Marine Corps, to the team, to the unit, because we knew we were going to be going through some pretty nasty stuff. So we needed that commitment to be there so that the resilience would be there. And I think this is where we have not done the same thing necessarily when it comes to our workforces, when it comes to Gen Z in particular. I don't think it shows a level of commitment to entry level workers today, for example, to allow what's happening at scale to be happening. I don't think there's enough dialogue happening about what types of entry level jobs are still highly valuable and prized, and are we making those hires? Are we developing the leadership capacity we need for the future? Are we listening enough and making accommodations where it's easy and where it's effective, as opposed to issuing blanket statements and making very one-sided unilateral decisions? Those things only spoil a generation of attitudes when it comes to work. And now when you look and they say, I go back to the example of healthcare, the CEO saying we have to shut down services in our hospitals because we can't get enough entry level workers to do the non-clinical things. And they say, what young person wants to make $20 an hour working with sick people when they can go set their own hours and drive for Uber or for Amazon or for DoorDash? And so you're like, wait a second, isn't the meaning and the purpose of working in healthcare like enough of a draw? And they're like, no, not when we act like jerks and we treat people poorly. We don't give them the help flexibility. That's where things break down. That mutuality isn't there. And it's causing, market facing problems.
It absolutely is. And I guess the question I want to ask, this is probably the multi-billion-dollar question, is so how do we go about fixing it? We know we need to get back to this place of mutualism, but maybe what are some words of advice that you would give on both sides, Matt? What are some words of advice that you'd give to organizational leaders right now, to work on mutualism? And what are some things that you would give to younger or older folks, in the labor market?
I think one of the first things is I think we have to get a clean read on the situation. I feel like we have so much misattribution happening. We're blaming very natural forces of entropy, and we're kind of personalizing them. Again, when that CEO that I mentioned is basically feeling betrayed because they have people that don't want to work for them. And I think that it's a misattribution. I think it's a lack of recognition of what's happening and what's going on in the psyche and the experience of the worker in that case. At the same time, I think the same is true and can be said for employees. I think a lot of times when you see companies that lay off 1,000 people with an email, not recognizing the market forces that are churning companies. Entire companies are being dismantled and destroyed and losing, in some cases, decades, if not longer, of competitive advantage overnight because of the technological upheaval. And at the heart of all of this, Jason, on both sides is fear. It's fear. Fear stokes ego, which creates this rise of self-interest, which only creates further separation. So, in order to quell the fear and to recognize that we have to have this return to unity and return to partnership and return to wholeness, then I think this is where we need to engage in more thoughtful dialogue and more constructive, kind of like you described in your relationship with your wife. I think there's a lot more relationality that needs to take place, a lot more sort of mutually supportive human stuff to offset the increasing sort of technological advancement that we're going through and all of the market upheavals that we're going through. And so when you practice active listening, where you make concessions where you can, and you practice mutuality, and you start to embrace, a more hopeful future where there is this positive collective outcome that we can work together and steer toward together, right? That's where you can start to increase the energy of commitment that holds our teams and our organizations and our communities together, right? When you see this taking place, I think that that's some of the earliest steps that need is get a clean read on the situation and why these things are happening at the macro level, how they're showing up at the micro level for a given individual, for example, or group of people, like early career employees, and then understand that there's the only way to get through all of this is to do it, in a collective sense. There's no amount of self-interest or ego that's going to allow us all to succeed. And I think when we feel that fear and we retreat, it only creates deeper, deeper problems. For the employees who retreat into individualism and say, well, then forget corporate, I'm just going to go be an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs can't do things at the scale that organizations can. So that's not a great response, right? If you feel that you had to, because it was the only way to get the autonomy and flexibility that you sought, then I would say to organizations, you better do a better job of trying to figure out how to provide that within a system that works for you, because otherwise you're going to lose access to top talent, and that doesn't help anybody. So this is where I think we just have to be prepared to reinvent the playbook and stop looking with our own lenses of the past and how it used to work and try to get back to some quote unquote good old days that's never going to return, and recognize that because the nature of pace of change, there is no, well, once we absorb this, it'll slow down a little bit. It will never slow down again. It will never slow down again. And the reality is that the human energy of commitment is what we sorely need to draw us back together, keep us aligned, keep us cohesive, coherent, congruent, and moving forward together towards some positive objective that works for all in that sense of mutuality, as opposed to the anxiety-driven, ego-driven self-interest that only accelerates the natural breakdown that we're experiencing.
That makes so much sense in terms of how we need to proceed together. And as you were describing it, the word that was coming out to me as I heard you speak, Matt, was if you're a leader of an organization, if you're on the board, your CEO, the founder, owner, whatever it might be, if you're at the very top making the decisions, at the end of the day, whenever it comes to, we got to make an important decision on something, I hope you listen to this and you hear Matt. The word that was sticking out to me that's coming in my head is sustainability. I think so much we talk about profitability, and that's the thing we've been looking at with AI is we can be so much more productive. We can be so much more efficient. We can get to market faster. We can decrease or improve our margins because we're going to decrease cost of being able to deliver our goods and services. I get all that. I hear you. But you can also be a sustainable company. And I think about Simon Sinek, and he talks about, the infinite game, right? I think the ones who are going to benefit the most from AI are the ones that are thinking through the lens, the companies that aren't just saying, oh, this means it's going to let me get rid of X number of people and be able to just displace what they, I don't think those companies are going to win in the long run. I think they're going to be really challenged. And I think we've already seen that with some of the companies like Klarna that then did a mea culpa and were like, yeah, we probably shouldn't have gotten rid of our entire customer support department of humans. They do a much better job than AI does. So we need to start bringing some of them back. If companies start thinking more in terms of what's sustainable, what is the blend of AI and humans that helps deliver the most value for the world, for our customers? That is what leads to abundance mindset. When we're only focused on quote unquote profitability, I think that's when it starts shifting to scarcity mindset. And yes, that might be good for some shareholders, some people at the very top, but it's not good for the world. It's not necessarily good for the people who are creating and delivering the value. So I really hope that we are moving in this direction where this is causing us now, this new force that is going across all verticals and reshaping the whole economy, this artificial intelligence. I hope it's making us finally come to terms with a lot of the things we've talked about that you and I and so many others have said are essential. Having a healthy culture, employee experience, taking care of your people is really important. I'm hoping that even though we're going through some challenging entropy moments, as you put them right now, of going through this change, I'm hoping this will be the final thing that perpetuates us into getting into more of an abundance mindset to be like, hey, this thing is so powerful potentially, it could lead us down a place that we don't want to go that's not good for much of anybody except 0.0001% of the population. And that's not good for our species, right? So let's choose to move this other direction to figure out how we make it a force for good and enable it to help people get more meaning from their work, deliver better work, have more time to spend doing whatever it is that they want. If it used to take 40 or 50 hours to get X amount of work done in a week, if it can get down to 10, 20, and then they've got that extra time, that's fantastic. Like that's the vision of the future we want. I want to mention something here, Matt. I want to get your comment on it. Get your tinfoil hat on. Okay, with me for a minute here. Here we go. So, The Age of Disclosure is a movie that just recently came out on Prime. And we're not going to go down that road of whether or not, you believe in UAPs and non-human intelligence and stuff like that. But the reason I bring it up is Marco Rubio was one of the people on this documentary that was talking about UAPs and non-human intelligence. And he brought up this concept that I'd never thought of before, and I think it ties into our conversation today, and I want to get your reactions to it. He used the term strategic surprise. He was talking about how in the history of humanity, typically civilizations are caught off guard or surprised whenever there's a new capability that they thought would never be possible is then unleashed. And it's like, oh crap, I didn't know that that was possible kind of thing. Think about like flight. Think about like landing on the moon. Think about the first time an automobile ever reared its head and someone was like, that's possible to actually have something that's rolling on wheels and transports you somewhere. I think we're kind of in this moment of strategic surprise when it comes to artificial intelligence in terms of what the capabilities are, that it's very easy to be like, oh, I don't think it's going to be able to do all those things. And it's like, if you extrapolate this out enough, 20, 30, 40 years, there probably is a good chance that it's going to even be able to do eventually a lot of the blue collar type work, working with the hands. Like the robotics will probably get to that point. The reason I bring that up is we shape the future and we should be declaring what we think are the valuable things in work that give us dignity, that bring value to the world, and that are the things that we're going to say, you know what? AI shouldn't do this, or we're only going to use it in these specific ways for this, but these are going to be the types of work that's important for humans to do. And I think that's something that we've thought is, we'll get to that later on. I'm starting to have the feeling that these are conversations we need to start having now of not only business leaders, but even as a society in terms of the governance of AI, the shaping of the economy, what types of work humans will be doing, what types of work AI will be doing, whether or not there's a tax to bring in universal high income. I'd love your reaction to some of those things around this thought, like strategic surprise, and not just being like, oh, I'm not so sure AI is going to be able to do those things, because I think sometimes that's when we might be surprised, is if we don't prepare for that kind of a future and shape it the way we want to.
Yeah, I think what's happening is that the amount of time it takes between, a novel development, and it's almost always, I shouldn't say almost always, but a lot of times it's technological in nature, right? So when you think about like the wheel, as you mentioned, or fire, okay, that was probably a long time ago. What about flight? You're like, okay, well, that was a little bit closer. What about radio versus television versus color television? We've seen some of those charts about the adoption curve versus cell phones versus something like ChatGPT, which is probably the latest major technological innovation that really caught fire within like 2 years now. You're talking about hundreds of millions of daily active users. And because everything is more hyper connected than ever, that's going to be what happens now. And so all of a sudden, we have to be prepared that these strategic surprises are not only going to be developed faster than ever, because we've got more and more technology creating technology, or at least assisting technologists to create technology, but the adoption of them and the viability and the pervasiveness of them is going to be faster than ever too. And I think that's the part that makes it feel different than when I was younger. Like I was old enough that when I would go home, well, for my military service, my father was a geek and he was like very interested in the early days of the internet. And so when I went back, I'm old enough that we had only, you would connect to the local public library with your modem and you could get a text based interface to the internet. And you could search it like the CIA fact book and just some other text like based resources. There was no graphical web at all. Then I would go back to military service, come back several months later, and all of a sudden he'd say, come check this out. Now there's a graphical web browser called Mozilla. Ooh, wow, that's a real game changer. Well, months of me being deployed and then come back and be like, "Oh, what's the latest?" And he would tell me what the latest was. Well, now every week it seems like there's something new and amazing. So we're like, "Oh, wow, this. Did you know it could do this? Did you know it could do that?" Inside our companies, you're like, "Holy cow, when's this going to slow down?" And say, "It's not. It's not going to stop." So I think you're right to think about it's happening to this point where shame on us if we don't realize that this pace is only going to continue, that it would be to say like it will never be able to X, Y, or Z is probably pretty short-sighted. I don't care what industry we're in, it's doing things, and we'll continue to do things. But ideally, what we'll find is we'll find the friction points. When do we need, for example, technology to help us close gaps that we just weren't getting to otherwise in terms of creating a quality of life? Or in terms of providing higher order service to ourselves and to society, versus just great filters on TikTok videos. Not that there's not value in that, but let's just say it's in a different category. So I think that it's wise now to start saying, if this continues the way we expect it to, and I fully expect it to, what will that mean for us from an ethical, moral, societal sort of what are the implications of that? What I don't expect to get is agreement. I don't think you're going to find universal agreement around taxation, around policy, around ethics, around guardrails. We are Americans, after all. We don't like to be told what to do. And a lot of it's going to just continue to take time to hash out. But again, rather than lobby judgment and create further division because we just don't agree because we didn't take the time to listen, I suggest that we properly attribute these entropic forces in nature as to what's really causing division, as opposed to making it more personal than it needs to be. And recognize that as long as we approach in a spirit of partnership, we're going to be okay. Just like in my relationship with my bride of 30 years, like it's going to work itself out, even if we have a little bit of a rift. If I try to make it go faster, I'll probably make it worse. And it's just one of those things where we have to recognize and see things a little bit more clearly. If you're in a young relationship and you start to personalize everything, not realizing to take a step back and understand, well, why this person feels that way or why this happened, it's going to make for a much more bumpy ride.
That is wise counsel that can only come from a happily married person of over 30 years. So there you go. Kudos to you and Mrs. Poepsel. Matt, as we're getting ready to wrap up, we've covered a lot today. You have given us a lot of tremendous insights. But I got to ask you this question. I usually love to wrap up with this one, and that is, what's something we haven't covered that you'd like to, or maybe what's a question you thought I'd ask that I haven't? What's something we should wrap up with, you think?
Well, I think that one of the things that we started our conversation with was talking about this broken promise in many ways that we've issued to, the generations that come behind us. I think we have, if we can put on our hat of stewardship, if you will, and realize that our time on this earth is short. For me, shorter than some of your younger listeners, perhaps. But I feel like no matter what, we know how this movie ends, and I think it's not comfortable to think about or talk about, but it's true. And I think if we can use that not as a reason to stoke our fear and to see our finitude as something that we should try to pretend isn't going to happen, but instead use it to gain the perspective of saying, while I am here, like what can I do to support and to act as a good steward for those who are going to come up behind me, right? Generations. I'm very fortunate to have served in the Marines and consider myself part of a lineage that stretches all the way back to 1775 and into the future, long after I'll be gone. So I have that notion in me, and I think we all are. We're part of this lineage of our workforce, our families, of humanity. And so when we sit down and we say what's possible, not for me, because my time here is short, but for us all, right? In terms of the type of future we're going to create, as you shared with us a little bit earlier of how that might play out. I think it'll serve us better than if we operate from our own self-interest about, well, here's what I would like to happen. You know, as an old product guy, I was always taught my opinion, while interesting, is irrelevant, right? How do you remove and reduce your own self-interest and stop putting your thumb on the scale and start to say what serves Gen Z, yes, but also Gen Alpha and Gen Beta that's right behind them. What kind of world are we wanting to create for them? How do we want them to see an economic engine of capitalism? And how do we want them to see an increasingly technological world that affords them opportunities and doesn't just continue to squeeze out the best parts of life and relegates, we get the leftovers, right? It doesn't have to be that way. And I don't think the future is purely utopian or dystopian. It'll be a mix of both, like always. But I think we do make deliberate choices, and we have to take some accountability when it comes to the type of future that at least we're trying to help to create, for those who come up behind us. So that's probably the one thing I would say that I'd love for us to keep in mind is that no matter, how long you think you have, it's not as long as you might want. And so while you're here and while you're able, let's create the kind of world that we want others to inherit.
I love that. Let's use our agency to make sure we're building the future that we want. I love that. This has been Matt Poepsel, the godfather of talent optimization. Now you know why he's called that. It's pretty brilliant, folks. He laid a lot of brilliant insights out there for us today. Here's one of the things I want you to do, and then I'm going to ask Matt how you can get in touch with him. But here's what I want you to do. He is the host of a phenomenal podcast, even better than this one. This is Amateur Hour. Who are we kidding? His is a professional podcast called Lead the People, and it's brought to you by the Predictive Index. And here at People Forward Network, we enjoy supporting that show and getting it out to as many leaders as possible because it's damn good. That's how you can be listening to Matt's wisdom and those of the brilliant guests, some of the best minds in the world that are thinking about these type of topics and how to lead businesses with integrity and with sustainability into the future. Go subscribe to his podcast on your favorite podcast platforms on YouTube, Lead the People. Matt, how else do you want folks to reach out and get in touch with you with your content?
Yeah, thank you, Jason. I'm a big fan of LinkedIn. I'm on there all the time. I like sharing my insights there. I love connecting with people there. I love meeting people there. So give me a follow and connect with me on LinkedIn if I can be of service in any way.
Love it. Matt, thank you for joining us. Thank you to all of those who are out there that were joining us on this live stream and those that are listening to the podcast. Hey, next time we do one of these, hop on the live stream. Could be like Susan. Susan, thank you. You could drop your questions in there and be a part of the conversation in addition to listening to it. Until next time, we'll see you. Keep working forward and making the world a brighter place. Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Matt. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Jason.
Thanks for tuning in to Working Forward. If you like what you hear, please hit the subscribe button wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Until next time, here's to building tomorrow today.